the heart of your system.
I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. This is Leo Says, my occasional opinion piece, and we have news from the usual suspects of Intel, AMD and Nvidia, but also Supermicro, not a name you often hear me say. In fact, I don't think I've ever said it in a Leo Says. And this is a story broken by Bloomberg. So Supermicro is a big manufacturer of workstation and server motherboards. Hence, they don't really feature in Kit Guru's line. Although I did recently do a Z370 motherboard of theirs, and I will be doing a Z390 of theirs. Come to that in a bit. Bloomberg's just done a far-reaching story which dates back to activity from 2015, and the report is that it turns out security problems. Chinese people, let's say the Chinese state, basically infiltrated spy chips, tiny little spy chips described as being smaller than a grain of rice, and by the look of it a lot smaller than a grain of rice, into PCBs, so the substrates that are actually used to build motherboards upon. At what level exactly Supermicro is involved in this remains to be seen. Whether the story is true remains to be seen, although there certainly seems to be some truth in it. Bloomberg is quoting anonymously 17 different sources, 17 across America. So people from within Amazon, Apple, the security services and all sorts. So although they're all anonymous, it would appear that either this is hoax or scam of the century or a truly massive story. So the timeline seems to be that people within the Chinese state decided it'd be a jolly fine idea to infiltrate the hardware in the supply chain. I mean, this is common sense. This goes back to Bill Clinton and the Clipper chip, the idea that if you can't spy on hardware sort of unofficially, you should do it by putting chips into it. That died, and then as we know, subsequently through Snowden, the Americans have got a number of strategies of getting inside hardware, implanting software on laptops and all sorts of such like. The Chinese obviously are upstream of all this. None of this hardware, to the best of knowledge, is actually manufactured at source, at root in America. It all comes ultimately from China and Taiwan. Certainly the components do. I mean, look at an iPhone designed in California, certainly ain't made there. So the idea was that a number of subcontractors to Supermicro, seemingly the people that make the PCBs, the fiberglass boards on which motherboards are manufactured, were lent upon, persuaded, or in some other way to change the designs of these boards, and these tiny little chips are implanted in the boards, apparently within the between the layers of the PCBs, such that they were naked to the invisible eye. And these chips would bypass the baseboard management controller, the BMC, which means that you can't possibly detect them within your system. They don't exist to the system. They're like a hardware rootkit, and that means that you can inject code, tell the chip to reach back to your own servers, and so on and so forth. It would appear to be a tiny chip that gives you complete access to a server, but there are a number of problems here. The most obvious being is if you can infiltrate the PCB, you don't know where the PCB is going to end up, which server, which model of boards it's going to end up in, and then which server specifically. And the only way around that is that you have to basically infect tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these boards, which then end up in various servers. The two names mentioned, Apple and Amazon, so clearly important targets. If you can get in their data centers, you're getting to some stuff. On the other hand, potentially what you're getting to is music, or an Amazon web store for fluffy dogs, or because of course Amazon Web Services, AWS, is not just Amazon's own stores. It could be Kit Guru if we're hosted on AWS. Where you end up, what data you have on the server is entirely unknown. Of course, it moves around. So what use this would be to the Chinese, it's almost entirely pot luck. If they can infect successfully tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of servers, what they actually have access to, who knows? But potentially they get their hands on some good stuff. And then you move on to the big news there, which is that Supermicro's share price has cratered after this Bloomberg story. It dropped initially by 50%. It's now recovered very slightly. It's down over the past 3 or so days by about 40%. A truly massive impact. And yet, Supermicro, Apple and Amazon have flatly denied the story. I mean, they've denied it in terms that are so all-encompassing. They haven't quite said this is total horse feathers, but they have pretty much left no room for doubt. Apple's then followed this denial up by saying, and we're not under a gagging order, because after the Snowden stuff we learned that actually these companies are obliged to lie if the government tells them to lie, upon pain of going to a 6x6 cell, and you can understand why they'd then do that. But if we take the we're not under a gagging order as being genuine, there seems to be a gulf. We've got Bloomberg's story, and we've got the denials from Apple and Amazon in particular. Now, we can understand that Supermicro, if they're in a terrible position, might potentially lie about the truth of the situation. You could understand that. Apple and Amazon, were they to do that, they are American companies. They have duties to shareholders. They are massive American companies. If they were to lie in a way that affected their stock price, this would have huge implications. I cannot quite go as far as to say they simply could not do it, because with the security aspect to it, if the CIA and the NSA have told them you must not let the cat out of the bag, then probably that, I hate to use the word, but trumps the position with the stockholders. Nonetheless, as things stand, the denials from Apple, Amazon, and Supermicro are there, and the Bloomberg story is here, and in between there is a gulf, and it does not seem that all four of these parties can be correct. And of course, at the root of the whole thing is, we know full well the Chinese want to have their hands in all the servers and routers and phones and all the rest of it, because why wouldn't they? All this kit's being manufactured in China and places in which China has very heavy influence. The point with Supermicro being is they have a plant in the US which is apparently staffed almost entirely by Chinese and by Taiwanese, and the language is Chinese. So even though it's physically in America, components are coming from China, subcontracted then out to further companies which in turn are Chinese. The staff are Chinese. The Chinese state has a massive opportunity, and it would seem that they have taken advantage of that. However, as I say, the companies in question have flatly denied it. More, I am sure, will come out of this, but the idea the Chinese have decided to use this approach to attack the process, the flow of materials purely for Supermicro doesn't seem very likely. What about all the other companies in this market? I mean, surely, it just makes sense. I'm not suggesting your gaming PC motherboard has been attacked in this way. I mean, who knows? But server workstation boards, sure. If they're able to infect the workstation boards that are being used by Lockheed and all the other companies, I mean, well, why wouldn't they? So this story, I'm quite sure, will run and run. Right now, there is a massive unknown, but Supermicro's share price, wow, that's in trouble. Moving on, Nvidia, short one this. RTX 2080. I had a really simple decision when I bought my RTX 2080 Founders Edition, because I've already used it in two PC builds actually for case reviews. It's a real simple thing. It's the new hardware. It looks more up to date than the 1080 Ti up on the shelf behind me, which is still a very fine graphics card. I was obliged to make the decision, so I was actually one of the people that pre-ordered a 2080, and I'll probably have to get another. Whether I go all the way and actually get a 2080 Ti, I mean, not so sure about that at the moment, because prices are astronomical. And of course, part of the reason, apart from using in case reviews, is I've already been sent an EK water block to go on the 2080, and I'm going to be having a look at that in the near future, along with various other graphics blocks. So for me, it was just, I had no choice. The horrendous price was just one of those things, a burden to bear. As for the customers, well, really difficult decision. And obviously one of the things holding people back from buying 2080, apart from the astronomical price, was it didn't actually do anything. I mean, better than the 1080 series because it's newer, but the ray tracing, absent. And as of yesterday, Windows has just been updated. Windows 10 has had the fall update, or autumn as we call it here in the UK, and now supports ray tracing. I ran DX Diag just to see what version of DX is installed, and all I got was DX12. So I didn't actually see anything leaping off the page at me that said you now have ray tracing, but perhaps that's because that system was running a 1080 rather than 2080. But anyway, Windows has been updated, which apart from anything else probably means that all benchmarks up to date can now be forgotten about and start over with the fresh Windows, fresh DirectX, And Nvidia's been updating drivers. There have been at least 3 driver updates in the past week. So we've got a whole tranche of new stuff, and now of course we want games to be patched to support ray tracing. I actually want to see ray tracing in action. I've got Windows, I've got DirectX, I've got the graphics card, I've got the option of cooling it to get more performance from it. I want to see it in action. I haven't yet seen ray tracing for real. Following on very shortly, 17th of October, we're going to have RTX 2070, which we assume will be a cut down version of 2080, so just less, and hopefully it'll be the same performance as a GTX 1080. I must confess right now, apart from the pricing being $499, just like, yeah, okay. I'm not quite sure what it's going to do, but until we see the ray tracing aspect, we won't know. Will 2080 ray tracing blow me away? Will 2070 ray tracing be any good? What's it actually going to do? So obviously there's going to be a whole swathe of reviews, but a big unknown there. And then we have the 2060, which at the moment is rumored to be GTX 2060, so no ray tracing, which suggests that the ray tracing element falls off as the grunt of the graphics card drops, which is why I've got my, I don't know about 2080, so 2070 is all the more unknown. GTX 2060, well, in that case, why not a GTX 1070? Obviously, while stocks last. But and then we'll have moved on through the Nvidia thing. But the fact that we now have DirectX 4 ray tracing, yeah, that's a significant step. Now we need the games. We want to see Shadow of the Tomb Raider doing its ray tracing thing. Incidentally, that game, I was bored. I mean, it looks okay. It looks like previous Tomb Raiders. It plays well. But it really was run around, shoot bow, kill animals, kill people with stealth. More stealth. I mean, there was more stealth this time rather than flat out going for it with your gun. But no, it's 50 quid. I mean, I spent it. I've enjoyed the game, but I wasn't blown away. I really wasn't. So unless the ray tracing introduces some new element that I simply haven't seen so far, then... And then we have Intel. So Intel is about to launch its 9th gen desktop CPUs along with Z390. This is all obviously very solid rumour now. It's been going around for blooming weeks. We know a huge amount about it. We just want to get our hands on the hardware and actually benchmark it and see how it performs. Core i9-9900K, 8-core, 16 threads, allegedly approaching 5 GHz clock speeds. That should just destroy 2nd gen Ryzen 7, which, 4 GHz. And not such great IPC. Core i7-9700K, 8 cores, 8 threads, so an i7 without hyperthreading. That's going to be a fun thing to look at, because that ought to be a good performer. Again, you'd assume 5 GHz-ish in terms of performance. You'd think the thermals would be slightly better without the HT, but you'd think lacking HT with 8 cores of hardware, that should storm along. Looking forward to seeing that. That also apparently soldered. And then we get the Core i5. I wonder whether that's going to be soldered, because historically the Core i5s have been the real performance and you can crank up the speeds on those fellas. But the fact that the i7-9700K is effectively a Core i5, not having hyperthreading, perhaps that's going to be the sweet spot of performance. Intel is in a really strange position. They still dominate the gaming desktop market. They are suffering with the inability to go to 10 nanometer. They're stuck with 14 nanometer. Their plans have been just completely put into turmoil, and yet demand for their parts is just astronomical. And that's despite Spectre, Meltdown, all the rest of it. There are so many reasons why Intel ought to be having just the worst time of its life. Right now, they're having a brilliant time. Although this feels to me like the end of that particular era. I don't know where the next phase is going to go. As things stand, they're having to crank up investment to produce more 14 nanometer parts. They'd already committed to spend $14 billion in this year. They're now added $1 billion. So 15 billion. Now the headline was Intel to spend another billion, invest another billion this year. But going from 14 to 15 doesn't sound so great. So in a way, they're trying to grab the headlines of that 1 billion figure. As to where they're spending the billion and what they're doing with it, we don't know. They've come up with this statement, so I assume it's completely true. But quite what the impact is going to be, I'm less convinced about that. So it strikes me as a very good headline. As to how it's actually going to carry through in the real world, don't know. But for the time being, 14 nanometer parts clearly through 2018 is absolutely the thing. And by the look of it, 2019, because we're now looking 10 nanometers is going to be 2020 by the sound of it. That is just a catastrophe. But from the point of view of the end user, if they can deliver 14 nanometer parts that really work, 14 nanometer plus parts, no doubt, then that's going to be absolutely brilliant for the consumer, particularly with soldered heat spreaders without blooming Tim. The impact on AMD, now that's an interesting one. So on the desktop at the moment, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, good parts, but the money for AMD is with EPYC. And EPYC, as we know, is moving to 7 nanometer. Now, 7 nanometer and on TSMC, 10 nanometer with Intel, 12 and 14 nanometer with other foundries. They are not directly comparable. We know that. But nonetheless, AMD moving to what they're calling 7 nanometer with EPYC and up to 64 cores, albeit most likely debuting at 48 cores, that is going to be another game changer from AMD. So we've got Threadripper is currently up to 32 cores, that's 4 12 nanometer chiplets. Which would be interesting because they could potentially do 32 cores on 2 chiplets at 7 nanometer. That I'd like to see because the 32 core Threadripper is a strange fellow because of memory access on the desktop. It's quad channel rather than 8 channel, and 2 of the cores have access to memory and 2 of the cores have to do a hop and a step to get there. So if Threadripper was to become 32 core on 2 chiplets rather than 4, that on the workstation desktop would be absolutely fascinating. EPYC 7 nanometer up to 64 cores, but call it 48 cores. That should move AMD into a different league in the server workstation market. And if we have a thing going on where motherboards are being torn up and thrown away because of security concerns, then I imagine it's going to mean that more hosting companies are going to be more keen to make a complete transformation in their hardware. So those 2 platforms, which are, after all, pretty much the same socket, are hugely encouraging for AMD. AM4 is a slightly different story. 2nd gen Ryzen 7 is a very good processor. The dynamic overclocking, the XFR2, is really good. Love it a bit. Precision Boost Overdrive works very well. But on the desktop, AM4 covers both Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, but also APUs. And the thing is that the Picasso APU is expected to move to 12 nanometer. But the thing is that Raven Ridge came along after the original Ryzens, and it's an improvement on the original process. In other words, it'll be very much an incremental improvement. Also, the graphics will still be Vega. I can't see Navi is still a way off. So if we are talking about Vega graphics, you're looking for improvements in the CPU side of things, and a tinkering with the fabrication process doesn't seem like it's going to make a lot of difference. If, on the other hand, the CPU part of the APU can be made 7 nanometer, which is Renoir, which is a year out, if instead that was pulled forward, pure speculation, that could potentially become an 8-core APU with Vega graphics. Half the chip is the CPU, half the chip is the GPU. That could be a really good combo. I'd love to see that. Balanced against that, what AMD really needs is higher clock speeds. Intel heading towards 5 gigahertz, AMD is basically 1 gigahertz behind, and it hurts them. If they can increase core count, it might help. I mean, I'm not sure how many cores you need on the desktop. 4 cores is a lot of cores. 8 cores is a huge amount of cores. Moving beyond 8 cores at the moment, you get benefits in things like video editing and such like, or if you're using Blender. But games, no, you just don't. How many cores you require at the moment? 4 good, 6 okay, 8, that's a lot. So higher core count okay, higher clock speed, huge benefit to be had there. If AMD with its move towards 7 nanometer can ramp up clock speeds rather than concentrating on core count, I think there could be some colossal benefits to be had there. APUs, they also of course focus on efficiency. Efficiency is a huge part of what AMD has been up to. And that has its benefits, of course, particularly in small form factor systems. But if you're looking at a compact PC that can game but without a graphics card, well, there's a lot to be said for clock speed. I'm not exactly saying damn the power, because the power does matter. Heat matters a lot. But nonetheless, get those clock speeds up, and I think that would be something well worth seeing. If we can see higher clock speeds from AMD for CES 2019, That would be a huge leap forward, because Intel with its 9th gen is absolutely not sitting still, despite the fact it's stuck on pretty much the same fabrication process. AMD, yep, they definitely need to respond, and they have the potential to respond. That's the thing about them. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. I'm Leo Waldock. This is Leo Says.